Hello everybody, it's Kier from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here to talk about my favorite nonfiction books that I read in 2022. Also, it is very, very warm today, so I have the fan on. Hopefully you can still hear everything fine, but if not, I always add captions to my videos, including this one, so please feel free to use those. And yeah, these are not necessarily going to be nonfiction books that came out last year. I think most of them aren't, actually, but some of them will be. They're just ones that I read last year. I will also link the playlist of my end of year content and favorites and all of that. And last disclaimer is these are not in any particular order. Like, these are not ranked or anything. I never rank my nonfiction because I just don't think that would be possible or helpful. So they're just in the order that made them easiest to stack. And I'm actually going to start out with two of them, if I can find my list. It was in a book. We're off to a great start. I'm going to start off with two that I actually don't have with me. One of them I read on audio from the library, and one I just can't find my copy right now, but it's here somewhere. So the one I listened to on audio was On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed. I will put the audio narrator in captions. This is, of course, a nonfiction book. I'm going to try not to say that every time because it's so automatic, but this is a very short one that is about the history of the holiday Juneteenth, what it means and what it represents and how it came to be celebrated, and also, I think crucially, or very interestingly for this book, it is also connecting that to wider parts of American history, specifically the history of Texas, but also just the US in general, and kind of like race and racism in general. And I just thought this was so well done and so interesting. I think it's a great example of a nonfiction book that can take something very specific and address it specifically, but then also connect that to much bigger things and issues in a way that is like equally balanced between those things. And I also really like the kind of underlying like message, or not even underlying, because the author comes right out and says this a few times, which is that if you truly love a place, that means that you have to be able to criticize it and to talk about the things that are wrong with it, and that it can do better and needs to do better, which I think is really important. Then the one that I have somewhere is A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. This is a collection of essays by a native author, and she has lived both in the US and Canada, and this is so brilliant and beautifully written. It is intense. It deals with like the author's struggles with depression and mental illness, and it also just deals with the history of the things that we have done to Native populations and how those things continue to have impacts today, and those things continue to happen today. But there's also a lot of beauty in this book, and I just like the writing is absolutely gorgeous, but not in an overly flowery and descriptive way. It's very like lovely in the smoothness and in the rhythm and in the way that Alicia Elliott describes these really big ideas or really like emotional moments in ways that are, again, beautiful but still very clear. I just think that is incredibly impressive, and one of the strengths of this collection is I think it shows so clearly why history matters and why, I mean, history is not even past, you know, like to paraphrase a famous quotation. But yeah, very glad I read that one. I definitely learned a lot. Then getting into the actual stack I have here, I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. This is a very short essay by a trans woman about her experience with masculinity, like specifically toxic masculinity, and also transphobia and misogyny, and it is just so well done. I think this is a really great, I think it'd be great as like an introductory kind of text, like if you are not sure where to start with you know, like memoirs by trans authors, for example. But I also think even if you are familiar with a lot of the concepts, the way that Vivek Shraya writes them and talks about her own personal experiences with them, I think makes this incredibly valuable, even if there are parts that you already know. And obviously, like, personal experience is always important. It doesn't need to like teach you something new, but yeah. And this is also, I think, the writing, like similarly to A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, I think the writing has a kind of beauty to it, but it doesn't obscure what the author is saying. And I also think like the way that this essay, like a lot of it is like, yeah, big ideas, but also these very, very specific examples and like circumstances, and like the way that, like, I think I mentioned this in my wrap up, but like one example of this like very small point that is not small, it's like so important, is like the idea of talking about men, specifically cis men, as being like one of the good ones, and what that does and how that is not actually helpful. Like, it's just, this is such a smart essay. Definitely recommend reading it, and thank you to my friend Kier for gifting this to me. What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalition by Emma Dabiri. This is another very short one, and this is, it's basically the title. Like, this is a response that Emma Dabiri finally wrote after getting this question from people over and over about, like, allyship and what white people can do and what they should do. And, like, Emma Dabiri was, like, very much like, this is not really my area. Like, her research and her focus and interest is in the Black Atlantic, so not really connected to racism and slavery in, like, Western countries. And so she finally did write this essay and publish it, and obviously I thought it was fantastic because it's on this list. So it really is like a book full of really concrete, like, here is what you can do and what you should do, but also, again, like, using these specific examples and also, like, talking about these big ideas. Like, Emma Dabiri is, like, her writing is so thoughtful, but she also makes these ideas, like, pretty accessible. I just really, really love the way that she writes, and one thing that I think is so valuable and interesting about this essay is that there are some big ideas that Emma Dabiri talks about that I don't know if I hadn't, like, come across them before, or I definitely hadn't read them. I definitely hadn't read about them in depth at all, but one thing that I thought was so interesting, like, she talks about one of the issues she has with kind of the modern version of, like, allyship is the way that a lot of times it seems focused on, or, like, the way they deliver the message is, like, people with power and privilege have to give something up. They have to sacrifice for those with less. And she points out a lot of problems with that, including, like, the condescending aspect, where it's very much like kind of a white savior sort of thing, is like, we will, like, raise up these people who can't help themselves and things like that. But she also makes the point that, like, that is not a very good way to go about it, because there are very few people who will give up something that they are told is an advantage, you know? Like, obviously, like, you should want to do it for, like, moral and ethical reasons, but Emma Dabiri's point is that the main way we should be approaching this is, like, everybody benefits from a society where these things are not problems, you know, racism and sexism and all of these different prejudices. Like, she gives an example of, like, using police brutality, for example, and she is very clear about the fact that police brutality is by far more likely to affect, like, Black people, specifically in the US, than any other race. But she also talks about how, like, police kill people of all races, and everybody benefits from a society where police cannot murder you with impunity. So just things like that that I think are so valuable and interesting, and just Emma Dabiri is so smart. I know she has another nonfiction book coming out, I think this year, and I can't wait. A Rhythm of Prayer, a collection of meditations for renewal, edited by Sarah Bessey. This is featuring a bunch of different theology writers. I'm pretty sure these are all specifically Christian writers, and they're from, like, a wide range of, like, denominations and experience and everything. I really appreciated the diversity in terms of, like, race and just experience that all of these writers had. But I did want to mention that I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, that these are all from different Christian denominations. But yeah, so this is a collection of kind of prayers or, like, meditations. Some of them read like poems, and I mentioned this in my wrap-up, but, like, a lot of these, something that I really loved about this and connected to is that a lot of these are about anger and how anger can be a creative force. Like, it can be necessary. Like, when you are angry about the way things are and you want things to change and you want to do something about that, that kind of anger is understandable and is actually necessary and powerful, which is just something that I resonate a lot with, especially with everything happening in the world over the last few years. And I also just found a lot of these, I guess, pieces really beautiful and moving. Like, of course, there are always going to be, you know, some that work for you more than others, but overall, I did really, really love this. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of writers here, too, that I want to check out other things by them. So if you're looking for this kind of nonfiction book, I would definitely recommend this one. History Smashers: The Underground Railroad by Kate Messner and Gwendolyn Hooks. This is in a series of middle grade nonfiction that I just love. I've talked about, like, various books in this series now. I think Kate Messner is, I think, the illustrator, maybe, and then Gwendolyn Hooks, I think, wrote it, or maybe she, like, collaborated on the writing. But one thing I appreciate is that when they have books that deal with specific topics like the Underground Railroad, obviously involving a lot to do with racism and slavery and Black people in the US. They actually have Black creators and like scholars involved in writing these, which I think is so important. Yeah, like I'm not going to get into too many specifics with this one because I basically feel the same about all of the books in this series that I read, which is that it is incredibly accessible and well written and interesting. The way they use like drawings and kind of graphic design elements, I think is really smart. I think like I always learn things from these, even though obviously I'm an adult, and I think they do a great job of introducing kids to really, really important ideas like intersectionality and like history, like where we get sources from and who that gives an advantage to and things like that. It introduces that to kids in a way that I think is, again, very accessible and also very like appropriate for their age. So just really love this series. Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, a story of justice and redemption. This book is definitely one of the nonfiction books that I have heard the most about, I feel like. This is a very, very well-known book, and I was actually gifted this by my friend Katie from A Sea of Tomes, and I am so glad because this had been one that I've been meaning to get to for ages, and I just hadn't gotten to it, and obviously I finally did. This is in part a memoir, but it's also just about capital punishment in the US and the prison system and the many awful things that it does. This is a really, really heavy book for very obvious reasons. So Bryan Stevenson is like writing this, again, as like kind of a memoir, but then interspersed with those chapters, there are chapters about particular cases he worked on and particular like issues with the US justice system, and especially like specifically with capital punishment and how that is applied. And this is just an incredibly important and moving book. There's also a lot about what the goal of societies and punishment and everything should be. So there are really beautiful parts as well. Like we see the way that Bryan Stevenson gets involved in like, you know, he founds the Equal Justice Initiative, and we see how he ended up doing that and ended up getting invested in and interested in and making this his life's work in not just abolishing the death penalty and abolishing like certain things about the way that it's used, but also like defending people who are on death row, who are often wrongly condemned. And I feel like this is one of those books, and it's always hard to predict this obviously, but I feel like this is one of those books that I hope that even people who think they are very set in what they believe about the death penalty and about, you know, who should have that applied to them and everything, I think that they could still get something out of this. I just think this is absolutely incredible, and I think it lived up to everything that I had heard about it. Next I have Radical Reinvention, An Unlikely Return to the Catholic Church by Kaya Oakes. This is a memoir, and this is a very interesting book to review because I just really personally connected to a lot of things about this. Like, it's funny because I gave this book 5 stars, and I read a newer book by this author, The Defiant Middle, which is also excellent, and that one I gave 4.5 stars, and like arguably that book is the one that is much more like recommendable to people and much more like, I think, widely applicable. I don't know, but this one just really really connected with me. First off, I love the way Kaya Oakes writes. She is so brilliant and clever, and she's got this dry humor that I love. And she also is not afraid to say what she actually means. And kind of like one of the main points of this memoir. So like Kaya Oakes talks about like leaving the Catholic Church and eventually coming back, and like very reluctantly in a lot of ways, and the way she talks about that is really funny. One of the big things that I think this memoir does is it talks about how people can stay with belief systems that they have issues with, you know, and they are working really hard to try and change those. And she doesn't try and like convince anybody else that they should do what she did or that they should go back or anything like that. That's not what she's doing. But I feel like in telling her experiences and in writing this the way she does, I think she really does a good job of showing that showing why people would choose to stay and fight for better things rather than cutting off cutting off a community, you know, or like any kind of group or like religious system or anything. So like she's not saying this is what everyone should do, but this is what she did, and I think she writes about that in a really compelling way. I also really appreciate the way that, again, she is very honest and upfront about the many problems in the Catholic Church, and she doesn't gloss over those, she doesn't overlook those, she doesn't like try and downplay how important those are. She's mad about them and she wants to do something about them, and I just really appreciate that. I feel like I'm rambling a lot about this book because, again, it's a hard one to review because I just connected to it very much. I should have mentioned this, I guess, but I have said a few times on my channel that I am myself Roman Catholic, and I just really resonated with a lot of the things that Kaya Oakes discusses. And also, one more thing that I think this book does that is really important is highlight how there are so many people like Kaya Oakes in the Catholic Church and in other institutions that are viewed in a very specific way. Like, for example, if you hear about, like specifically in the US, if you hear about the Catholic Church in political circles, if you hear about a high-level politician who is Catholic, it's usually somebody like Amy Coney Barrett. And one of the points that Kaya Oakes makes in this book, and she like backs it up with, you know, statistics and information, is that those kinds of Catholics are a small minority, which is not to say they aren't a problem. Obviously they are, but Kaya Oakes kind of points out that like one of the ways that people like that keep being successful is they convince the rest of us that there's too many of them to fight, you know? So anyway, this is great. I don't know how to talk about it, but I loved it. The Book of Hope by Jane Goodall and Douglas Abrams with Gail Hudson, a survival guide for trying times. I have to show off Under the Dust Jacket again because I just think this is one of the most gorgeous book designs I've seen. So this is exactly what it says in the title, and they started working on the interviews for this book around the time that the COVID pandemic started, and so the concept of a survival guide, you know, a book that you need to keep hope, is very topical, and still is, and I really loved this. I thought the layout was really smart. It's not like a straight up question and answer, although in a way the sections are kind of broken up by like topic or by question, but it flows very naturally, and I just love and admire Jane Goodall so much as a person, and she really has a lot of like unique or unusual or profound experiences that she can connect to this idea of hope, and why it is so important, like why it is absolutely necessary if you want to accomplish anything. And she talks about, you know, like climate and environmental activism. She talks about animal rights and of course like human rights, and she also talks about how interconnected all of those things are. This is kind of another example of like, well, you should want to do something because it is the right thing, but if that's not enough for you, you should want to you know, preserve habitats and you know, help animal populations because that's also good for humans, and vice versa. Like she gives an example of chimpanzees who are hunted in certain areas of the world for bushmeat, and how, you know, cruel that is, but she talks about how the reason that happens is because the towns in the surrounding area are in food deserts. You know, they really don't have a lot of other options, and so if you want to help the chimpanzees, then you also need to help the humans. And again, you should want to do those things anyway, but I thought this was really beautiful. It was a book I very much needed, I still need, I think a lot of people do, and I just really appreciated the things that she had to say and her thoughtfulness. And this is not like a book that sugarcoats things, it's a book that, like, you know, looks at what is happening and looks at what we can do about it, and I think that is so important. And kind of like I was saying earlier, it's like hope isn't just important to, you know, feel better and to like function better in the world, but it also is like absolutely necessary if you want to actually make things better, because like there has never ever been a time where telling somebody that there's nothing they can do and that, you know, everyone's doomed, there's no hope, there's never been a time when that has inspired somebody to act. Like, why would somebody act if you tell them there's nothing they can do? So I love this. Okay guys, slowly but surely getting to the end of the stack. I read a lot of like fantastic nonfiction last year, as you can see. Go Back to Where You Came From and Other Helpful Recommendations on How to Become American by Wajahat Ali. This is a memoir that I think is one of the funniest books I've read. Like, I've said this before, it is very rare that I will actually laugh out loud while reading, but I did with this book. I just think Wajahat Ali is absolutely hysterical, and I love the way that he writes. So he talks a lot about what it was like growing up as the child of South Asian immigrants. He talks about what it was like after 9/11, where he kind of became the poster child for like a moderate Muslim, and how, like, you know, problematic all of that is, to say the least. He talks about the many problems that the US has, but at the end of it, he kind of finishes, this is another one that like ends with kind of hope in spite of everything, which, to paraphrase, he's basically like, maybe this is dumb, but I still think we can do better. Like, he quotes the really beautiful poem on the Statue of Liberty and basically says, I think there's still a chance that we can fulfill that promise, you know? So there's a lot of like really beautiful and profound parts in this book, but also a lot of humor. And again, this is another book where I think Wajahat Ali does such a fantastic job of connecting specific examples or experiences he's had, and using those as a lens to talk about like bigger problems or bigger topics. So one of my favorite memoirs for sure. Awakened by Death, Life-Giving Lessons from the Mystics by Christiana N. Peterson. This is a very interesting book to like recommend or to say that I loved, but I did. This is a very comforting and profound and interesting book, and this is another one that like I think your experience with it is going to depend a lot on how personally you connect to it. So the author talks about how she started writing this book, or she like kind of approached this project because she has always been really afraid of death, and she kind of wanted to process that, and so she talks about how it has been viewed in different time periods, different like rituals and practices associated with death, and she contrasts those with the like modern Western world and the way that we have tried to like sanitize and hide so much of it because our culture is afraid of death, but we can't ever acknowledge that, which I just thought was very very thoughtful and very true. And she talks a lot about like different like scholars and like theologians throughout history, and I do want to mention that specifically she looks at this through the lens of the mystics, Christian mystics specifically, so just know that that is like the point of view of this book. But I thought this was incredibly beautiful, and I loved the quotations she included, and like the people that she kind of used as examples, or like she used in her book. This has like reaffirmed my love for George MacDonald. He just seems like such an incredible person, and I'm excited to keep reading things from him. But yeah, I thought this was incredible, and I do think that it is a very comforting book in a lot of ways. So yeah, obviously this book deals with death and grief a lot. I should have mentioned at the very beginning of the video, but I will put content warnings in the description box. But if this is a topic that interests you, or if it is something that you also struggle with, I just can't recommend this enough. I think it is beautifully done. Hidden Mercy, AIDS, Catholics, and the Untold Stories of Compassion in the Face of Fear by Michael J. O'Loughlin. This is another nonfiction that deals with grief a lot, obviously in connection to the AIDS epidemic, and this is a really, really heavy book for obvious reasons, but I thought it was incredibly well done. Yeah, Michael J. O'Loughlin is himself a gay Catholic, and in this book he is looking at the very varied responses from the Catholic Church during the AIDS crisis. Like, you had the official positions of the Catholic hierarchy, which were atrocious and led to so much more suffering than would have happened. But then you also have like individual people, like individual like Catholic lay people, or like people in orders who were actually loving their neighbor, who were actually going out and helping people, because regardless of what the like official press releases and everything were saying of like what, you know, the Pope's position on something is, or the Catholic Church position on some of this was, they knew that what they had to do was take care of people, and that it was as simple as that, which is not to at all diminish how difficult all of the work they did was. And similarly to Radical Reinvention, like Michael J. O'Loughlin is not writing this book to try and convince anybody that has, you know, for example, like suffered religious abuse from the Catholic Church in connection with being gay. He's not trying to convince anybody to like come back and give it another try or anything. He's just specifically talking about this period in history, and that there were so many people doing good, and there should have been a lot more, but it is important that we also look at the people who have done things that were important and that helped. And I feel like this is a nonfiction that is a great example of how like people didn't know any better is an excuse that doesn't really fly for me. because in every period of history there have been people who did know better. I feel like the writing style, some people could maybe find it too plain or straightforward. I personally feel like it really worked for the book because so much of this is like based on interviews and conversations that O'Loughlin has had with different people, and I feel like the way he wrote this, it kind of let them speak for themselves and tell their own story. So I actually liked that. I thought it worked, but yeah. A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Murder in Ancient Rome by Emma Southon. This book made me realize that I absolutely love Emma Southon and I will read anything she writes ever, pretty much. This was the first book I read from her. She is a historian of ancient Rome, and so this book, in addition to having, I think, one of the best titles ever, it talks about like the concept of murder in ancient Rome, and specifically how it kind of wasn't a concept, or at least not for everybody, and she uses that to talk about like what a culture's perspectives on like murder and death and like who is held responsible and who isn't, like what that tells us about what they valued in people, or if they valued people. And I love her writing style. I feel like it's something that, you know, probably wouldn't work for everybody, but she has this very like biting and very like casual kind of humor that I absolutely love. I thought this was like, the way she wrote some of these things is absolutely hilarious, but like I always say with nonfiction books that I think are funny, something I always appreciate is that she doesn't make fun of the things that she shouldn't. You know, like there are sections where she's talking about like children being killed and like the treatment of people in different like classes and everything, and basically the parts where it would be inappropriate for her to write very flippantly, she doesn't do it. And as I said, I just really appreciate that. I love her perspectives on these topics. I love how feminist this book is, how intersectional it is. She talks a lot about enslavement and how that played into the way that ancient Rome viewed life and death. And I also just learned a lot from this. I thought this was so interesting, and it also talks a lot about the many emperors who got murdered in ancient Rome. So yeah, I think this is brilliant, and I love Emma Southon. Okay, y'all, last few books, and I'm gonna try and go through these pretty quickly because they're all kind of similar. They're like those beautifully illustrated nonfiction about people from history who we should know more about and appreciate, whatever you would call that. Finish the Fight by Veronica Chambers and the staff of the New York Times, the brave and revolutionary women who fought for the right to vote. This was gifted to me by my friend Taylor, and yeah, I just thought this was great. I did really like the design and the layout, and this is basically about different women who were really instrumental in the women's suffrage movement, but because they were non-white or because they were marginalized in other ways, we barely know anything about them, or like we don't prioritize learning and talking about them. So I would definitely recommend this one. Anthology of Amazing Women, Trailblazers Who Dared to Be Different. This is by, where's the author? Written by Sandra Lawrence, illustrated by Nathan Collins, and I do really love the illustration style for these. And yeah, I really love the variety of women that this book talks about, and the many different ways of being a trailblazer and like being a feminist. And also there's like the sections that are the main biographies, but then there's also sort of mini biographies where it's like, you know, they couldn't fit all of the women that they wanted to talk about, but here's like a few extra. So yeah, like I never get tired of this genre of nonfiction. So I also thought that this one was fantastic. Notable Native People, 50 Indigenous Leaders, Dreamers, and Changemakers from Past and Present by Adrienne Keene. Once again, beautifully illustrated. And I mean, basically all of the books that are in this kind of subgenre that I love, the illustrations are great and the variety of figures talked about are great, because those are two things that I just really appreciate and notice. And I especially feel like with this one there was a special emphasis on Native Alaskans and Native Hawaiians, which I think is really important because at least in the US I feel like those indigenous groups aren't maybe talked about as much by white people, for example. But yeah, I thought this was fantastic. If you are looking to learn more about different Native changemakers in a lot of different like contexts, I would absolutely recommend it. And finally, Amazing Muslims Who Changed the World, Extraordinary Stories of Incredible People by Burhana Islam. Say it with me, illustrations are beautiful. And once again, great variety of figures here. And I also want to mention that I feel like this book did a good job of being written more like a story than some others, not in a way that like obscured the factual information or anything, but like if, for example, you're thinking about reading this with kids, I feel like this one lends itself really well to that because of the writing style. So yes, those are my favorite nonfiction books that I read in 2022. I hope I haven't forgotten any, but who knows, I've already been talking so long. Let me know if you have read any of these or if you're interested in any of these. Obviously, I highly recommend all of them, and let me know a nonfiction book that you read and loved recently. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!